In the pine-shadowed fields of North Carolina, whispers still drift about a supper that no one should have eaten. The year was 1845, when a wealthy plantation family gathered for what would be their last meal. Guests laughed over silver bowls and steaming pies, never knowing the hands that prepared them had been silent for years. Before dawn, the laughter was gone. Only bodies remained, mouths stained dark, and a kitchen fire that refused to die down, as if someone was still cooking long after everyone else was dead. The night of the supper opened warm and damp, the kind of heat that clings to skin even after the sun drops. Lanterns swung on the porch, casting yellow halos against wood gone soft with humidity, and wagons rattled up the road with guests eager for a rare feast. Inside, the dining room glowed like a stage. Candles burned low and slow in iron holders, their wax running down like pale fingers toward the white cloth below. Platters arrived, steaming, roasts shimmering with fat, corn cakes stacked high, and pitchers of dark wine sweating on the table. The family and their neighbors reached for the serving spoons, their talk a mix of gossip, hunting stories, and speculation about the cook they had never truly seen. They called her Effie, though no one seemed to know if that was a name or a title. She moved only in the shadows beyond the kitchen door, a muted figure with eyes lowered and a back straight as a blade. The master had once boasted that she could turn scraps into banquets, that her stews tasted like mercy itself. Tonight she had outdone herself. The smell of her food curled through the hall, thick and sweet and strange, like earth after a storm mixed with something older. Every guest remarked on it before their first bite, but hunger overcame caution, and knives slid through meat as soft as butter. For a moment, it was pure pleasure, the warmth of food, the soft hush of satisfaction, until one woman at the far end of the table dropped her fork and pressed a hand to her mouth. She tried to speak, but only a wet, choking sound came. Another guest began to tremble, his wineglass slipping from his fingers and shattering red across the white cloth. Chairs screeched back, candles flickered, and still more hands went to throats. The kitchen door did not open. No one saw Effie as the room turned into a silent storm of gasps and stifled cries, silverware clattering to the floor like falling bones. Outside, the crickets sang on as if nothing had changed. Inside, the supper bell swung once, twice, 3 times by itself, then went still. By morning, the dining room was a cathedral of the dead. The shutters had been thrown open sometime in the night, and flies crept like ink across the waxy faces of those still seated at the long table. Not all had fallen forward. Some remained unnaturally upright, hands still resting beside empty plates, eyes wide, as if something had caught their attention just before the breath left them. Blood had dried in the corners of their mouths, but not spilled across the table. The white cloth was too clean for what had happened. It was as if the dying had been quiet, obedient, like they'd been waiting for it. When Dr. Wainsfield arrived from 2 towns over, summoned by a rider before dawn, he stepped into the house with a handkerchief to his face, expecting fever, plague, cholera, but not this. He counted 13 bodies, all adults, all dead within arm's reach of a full plate. No wounds, no bruises, no signs of struggle, just open eyes and slack jaws. The skin around their mouths was blistered, not burned, but bubbling, as though something inside them had turned. He peeled back a lip on the youngest woman. Her tongue was black, cracked down the center like scorched wood. He found the same in the others. Some had blood pooled in their ears. One man had bled from the eyes, but there were no lesions, no odor of poison. When he opened the belly of the eldest guest, a judge, large and pompous in life, he found the stomach filled with food that had not yet begun to digest. It sat there like stone, thick, undisturbed, and cold. He cut deeper and found the heart muscle flaccid, barely holding shape, as if it had stopped before it could scream. The blood was wrong, too dark, too still. Not a single vessel twitched when sliced. Wainsfield stood in the ruined room and wrote what he could. A medical report made useless by silence. Immediate cardiac failure, he scribbled. Possible toxic ingestion. But he knew better. It was not natural. It was not clean. Something had watched them eat, had waited for their forks to rise, had counted the bites. He asked about the food, about the cook, but the only living servant he found had no words. A young girl, no older than 9, hiding behind the root cellar, her mouth covered in soot. She only pointed at the kitchen, then drew a circle in the dirt. Around it, 13 tiny crosses. He asked what it meant. She said nothing, but the wind changed, and from the open window came the faint clink of a spoon tapping porcelain, slow, deliberate, and coming from a room that should have been empty. They buried the dead before sundown, as was custom when a body left questions. The earth behind the plantation sloped gently toward the tree line, where pine roots drank deep and shadows never fully lifted. 13 graves in a row, no markers, just mounds of fresh soil under a sky that refused to brighten. The family had money, yet no stones were cut. No preacher was summoned. A prayer was mumbled by the master's brother, who paused halfway through the Lord's name like he'd forgotten how it ended. The air smelled of spoiled cream and pine sap. Crows sat in the branches overhead but did not caw. When the last spade struck the earth, the master's youngest son asked, "Where did she go?" His voice was small, but it cracked the silence like glass. The overseer, who hadn't spoken all day, looked at the boy and asked, "Who?" "The cook," the boy said, brushing dirt from his trouser knees. "Miss Effie. She made the stew." The overseer hesitated. Then he turned to the master, but the man had already started walking back to the house. He did not answer. He did not stop. Inside the dining room, the table remained as it had been left, plates crusted over, wine drying to syrup. But there was one chair that sat apart from the rest, tucked neatly at the end of the kitchen table, not the dining hall. Its cushion was faded red, the wood older than the others, carved with a name no one could read anymore. It had always been hers, though no one ever saw her sit in it. After the supper, the chair was found, pulled out, not pushed in, as if someone had risen in haste, and next to it, a single plate, untouched, no fork, no spoon, just a white porcelain dish, clean as bone, as if waiting for something that never came. The kitchen, too, bore no signs of struggle. The knives were washed and put away. The hearth had gone cold, though the ashes still held shape, logs half burned, as if the fire had been stopped mid-breath. But there was no sign of Effie, no footsteps, no apron, no cloth. Her small wooden box of spices was missing from its usual place on the shelf. Even her shoes, plain, worn things she left by the back step each night, were gone. Some whispered she'd run. Others said she had died too, and her body was simply hidden better than the rest. But no one had searched the root cellar. No one wanted to. That night, when the wind returned through the open dining hall windows, it carried the scent of warm broth and something beneath it, copper, earth, something deeper. The dogs would not cross the kitchen threshold. And the chair, the one at the end of the table, creaked quietly, as though someone had just sat down. The days that followed moved like syrup left too long in the sun, thick, slow, and rotting at the edges. The house was too quiet. No carriages came up the drive, no letters arrived, and no one played the piano in the parlor. The surviving family members, few as they were, kept mostly to their rooms. Meals stopped, not out of grief, but fear. The kitchen, once the soul of the house, now felt like a wound that wouldn't close. Still, the hearth never cooled. No one lit the fire, but it burned just the same. At first, they thought it was just old coals holding heat, but by the third day, fresh logs had appeared on the grate, unburnt but warm to the touch. Smoke climbed from the chimney at dawn, thin and steady, even though the kitchen door stayed locked. And at night, the smell of food returned, not the raw, heavy scent of pork or the tang of collards boiling over, but something sweeter, older. The scent moved through the floorboards, curling up the stairwell like fingers, making even the strongest stomachs twist with confusion. It was not hunger they felt, it was memory, the kind that didn't belong to them. The dogs were the first to turn. The older hound, Bristle, lay down by the back porch and refused to cross the threshold again. He trembled, whenever the door swung open. Another dog, the younger one, growled low whenever someone neared the hearth. On the fifth night, the master's niece claimed she heard whispering coming from the chimney, not from inside but above, like someone perched on the roof was talking to the fire. When she told her mother, she was slapped silent. That same night, a servant boy barely old enough to carry water approached the hearth to retrieve a pot left beside the coals. He was not seen again. No screams, no crash, just the clatter of the pot lid on stone, then stillness. They searched the house, the well, even the woods, but the kitchen remained untouched. One of the older housemaids, a quiet woman named Grace, claimed she saw him again the next morning. She had gone to gather eggs before the sun had risen and looked up at the window above the hearth. She swore she saw him standing there, eyes open, but not blinking, face pale as ash. His mouth was moving like he was trying to speak, but all she heard was the faint sound of spoons tapping porcelain, slow, rhythmic, like someone asking to be served again. When she told the others, no one believed her, but she packed her things that night and left without a word. The kitchen fire burned brighter the next morning. No one touched it, no one dared, but it was warm, and there were fresh biscuits cooling on the table, steam still rising like breath from something that should not have been alive. They called her Effie because they never cared to ask her real name. It was easier that way, a sound to summon her, a label to carry orders, something that made her part of the furniture instead of the blood. She had been on the property longer than most of the family. Some claimed she'd arrived as a girl, no older than 12, brought in under moonlight by a trader who left with no coin and refused to say a word about where she came from. Others whispered she had simply appeared one morning, already tall, already quiet, already knowing what to feed a man to make him weep and what to serve a woman to make her forget she was afraid. She wore no shoes in the kitchen and never stepped past the threshold into the main house unless called. But her food came like magic, warm, ready, exact. She knew how to stretch salt pork for 30 and how to make stale flour rise like heaven itself. When one of the children fell ill, it was Effie who boiled herbs no one else recognized, herbs that turned the sick child's fever into sweat, then stillness. When the mistress miscarried in the winter of '39, it was Effie who stayed up 3 nights boiling broth, whispering things into the steam that no one could hear, but that made the bleeding stop. They feared her. In that quiet way, the rich fear anything that doesn't beg. And so they called her Effie, soft enough to shout from the doorway, detached enough not to feel wrong on the tongue. She signed nothing, owned nothing, bled in silence when struck, and disappeared for hours at a time without explanation. When asked where she went, she would say only, "Nowhere the Lord sees fit to follow." Her room was not on any of the house plans. It sat tucked behind the larder, past a door so narrow only a child could slip through comfortably. Inside, a cot, a tin basin, a single candle, and on the floor, a series of hand-drawn circles made in ash and dried herbs. No one else entered that room, not even the housemaids. They said the air was too heavy, like something had soaked into the walls, and didn't want to let go. The only item of color in her space was a red ribbon tied to a bent nail above her bed, faded, frayed, stained with something darker near one end. No one remembered ever giving it to her. When the family sent out for census documentation, her name was never included. She was not listed as slave, servant, or staff. In the ledgers, she was referred to only as the woman behind the stove. And after the supper, when the bodies cooled and the hearth refused to go out, her name was scratched out of the ledger altogether, as if silence could undo what she had cooked. At first, it was just a sound, soft, low, and easy to dismiss as the shifting of old wood or the settling of stone. But by the third night after the supper, the pantry began to hum. Not loud, not constant, but just enough to stop a servant mid-step, to make a candle flicker, to freeze a hand halfway toward a jar of lard. It came in waves, rising and falling, like breath held too long. The pantry itself was small, barely wide enough to turn around in, lined with shelves of preserves and pickled things, dried herbs hanging overhead like wilted ghosts. The door was iron-latched, always locked from the outside, and the key kept in a drawer beneath the kitchen counter, yet several claimed to hear someone inside. A girl named Dinah, no more than 12, swore she heard whispering a woman's voice, low and steady, speaking words she couldn't understand, but couldn't forget either. She told the others it sounded like someone remembering a recipe out loud, but saying it backward, as if uncooking something. They laughed at her at first. Then one of the older boys, Matthew, pressed his ear to the door and said nothing. When asked what he'd heard, he only shook his head and walked out into the woods. He didn't return that night, or the next. When he finally came back on the fourth day, he was barefoot, shaking, and wouldn't speak at all. He simply sat on the back steps, staring at the pantry, mouthing something over and over. It wasn't English. The sound spread. Grace's replacement, a young woman named Ada, claimed she heard the hum, even from the second floor, like it rose up through the walls. She said it made her teeth ache and her dreams taste of vinegar and rust. She tried to sleep with cloth in her ears. It didn't help. One night, the latch was found undone, though the key hadn't been moved. The door creaked open an inch, just enough to show the edge of a broken jar on the floor, and something spilled across the threshold. Not jam or brine, but something pale and stringy, like thin curls of skin that had been shaved from a wrist. No one cleaned it. They just closed the door again. Nailed it shut this time. And still, the humming didn't stop. A visitor from town came to deliver flour and paused in the kitchen, sniffing the air. He said it smelled like sweetbread stew, the kind his mother made before she died, but when he lifted the lid of the pot left on the stove, it was empty, bone dry, not even a scorch mark. Still, he claimed he could hear a spoon scraping the bottom. When he left, he refused payment. Said the house didn't owe him anything. Said someone already paid with something that couldn't be named, but tasted like grief. The plantation's ledgers were kept in a chest with a broken lock, tucked beneath a patchwork quilt in the master's study, not for secrecy, but neglect. Dust lined the edges of the books like fine sugar, and the pages, stiff with age, clung together as if reluctant to remember. They contained names, births, harvest yields, purchases, punishments all scrawled in the same slanted ink that looked more like scratching than handwriting. It was the pastor who found them, not out of curiosity, but duty. He had come to offer comfort, to explain the unexplainable deaths through God's will, to calm the whispers that had begun spreading through the county like smoke. But he left with the ledger instead. Something had unsettled him in the house, not the silence, not the smell, but the feeling that every room was waiting for something. He brought the ledger back to his chapel and read it by lamplight. The first entry was from 1821. The last was dated just weeks before the supper. He read of livestock sold, debts paid, the names of every slave bought and born, columns of bodies reduced to numbers and costs, until he found the list of children. It was not a separate section, just names folded into margins, often without mothers named. A tally at the bottom of one page read 27, but as he counted, he found only 12 marked with death dates. He read it again. The names were unfamiliar. Most were never seen in the parish records, never baptized, never buried with ceremony. And besides some, faint pencil marks, circles, crosses, one name repeated 3 times, but spelled differently each time, as if the child had tried to return. The pastor turned the page and found a loose scrap tucked between the folds. It was thin and brittle, like onion skin, and held a short note in handwriting unlike the rest. The pot boils until it remembers. No name, no date, just that one line. He flipped the page again and stopped cold. The next sheet was darker than the others. It smelled faintly of iron. A thick red thumbprint sealed the corner, pressed so hard it had cracked the page. The writing was in French, half spelled, half slurred, as if written by someone who had never learned to hold a pen but had been told what to say. There were measurements, symbols, something about marrow and sweetness and silence. At the bottom, a list of names, not of people, but dishes, stews, pies, broths, syrups. The pastor read them aloud once and began to sweat. The candle flickered. He closed the book and walked to his basin, but his hands were already shaking. From the other room, he swore he heard someone stirring a spoon through thick liquid. He turned, but no one was there. Just the ledger, left open to a recipe written in red, waiting like it had been hungry for eyes all along. Before she was Effie, before the name was whispered or written or scratched out in ledgers, she had simply been the girl who stirred with her hands. That's what the older field slaves called her, those who still remembered the day she was brought up from the edge of the swamp, barefoot and blank-eyed, with mud to her knees, and a silence so thick it made grown men clear their throats. They said she wasn't crying, not from fear, not from cold. She just watched, not the master, not the sky, but the pot boiling over the fire. Her gaze didn't move when spoken to, but when the mistress collapsed from the summer sickness that same evening, it was the girl who walked into the kitchen, dipped her hands into the bubbling broth, and stirred. No scream, no burn, just skin in water hot enough to melt wax. The cook at the time, old Mabel, slapped her hard across the mouth, said she was possessed, said food made that way would sour the lungs. But the mistress lived. Her fever broke by morning. No one questioned it. They gave the girl a stool, a corner, a quiet place to work. She learned without being taught. She'd run her fingers across, hanging herbs, then pluck only what was needed. She could tell spoiled meat by the weight of the flies, not the smell. Once, she tasted flour between her fingers and told them it would make no bread unless someone died first. They used it anyway. That night, the stable boy slipped from the hayloft and cracked his neck clean in two. The bread rose perfect by morning. When Mabel died in her sleep 2 years later, the girl was barely 15 and already head of the kitchen. No one said it aloud, but they knew the change wasn't earned by age. It was earned by silence. She spoke little, but her food said enough. It comforted the grieving and made men weep without knowing why. One winter, the master hosted a traveling judge who praised the meal so fiercely he offered to take the girl back to Charleston, said she could be worth something in a hotel kitchen. That night, he woke up blind, claimed his eyes had simply closed and forgotten how to open. He left the next day. No one spoke of it again. The girl stayed, and with each passing season, she grew stranger. She never bled in front of anyone, never coughed, never limped, never aged the way others did. When she smiled, rare and soft, it never reached her eyes. Only the food changed. It grew deeper, heavier, fuller. Those who ate from her hands said it warmed them for days. But sometimes, after eating, they dreamed of ropes, of water too dark to see through, of a mouth beneath their own, whispering, 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 until they woke with their hands clenched into fists and their tongues tasting of salt and fire. The letter was found behind a loose brick in the dining room hearth, sealed with wax so brittle it crumbled beneath the pastor's thumb. Its paper was yellowed, lined with ash stains, and the handwriting inside ran like ink left too long in tears. It bore no address, only a single line at the top. March the 9th, 1831. The rest was confession. Not the kind offered to God, but to fear, to history, to silence, to something that had grown too large to keep behind the teeth. The words were from the mistress herself, though she never signed her name. She wrote of dreams that left her mouth full of soil, of finding red thread woven into her bed sheets in the shape of a noose, of her child's cradle rocking when no wind stirred. And always, the food. She claimed her bones began to ache the moment she swallowed stew. That broth made her teeth itch. That sweet corn made her forget her sister's name for days at a time. She blamed Effie, though she never dared write it directly. Instead, she called her the woman who watches the door. The letter described a night when the family gathered to vote 12 men with papers, pens, and eyes heavy with decision. They did not speak of freedom or punishment. They spoke of forgetting. A rule was agreed upon, sealed by fire and prayer. No one was to speak Effie's name again, not aloud, not in writing, not even to the Lord. Children were beaten for whispering it. New servants were warned. And when a traveler once asked who cooked the roast, he was met with silence and a plate piled twice as high. The letter named this pact the Silence Act. It was not written into law, but into blood. Every adult in the house signed the paper, and then it was burned ashes, stirred into the well, so all would drink the forgetting. The mistress wrote that after the pact, the house grew quieter. Effie remained, but her eyes darkened. The food became richer, stranger, heavier with every passing year. Sometimes it smelled like old rain, sometimes like copper. One night, the mistress claimed to see her own face, reflected in a pan not as she was, but as she would look in a coffin. She wrote that she began to understand, that names were not protection, but bindings, and they had cut the cord. At the end of the letter was one last line, not in English. The pastor copied it into his notebook and sent a courier to a university in Virginia, asking for translation. Weeks later, the reply came. The phrase was Haitian Creole, misspelled, but clear in meaning. It said, "You made her invisible. Now she eats alone." The pastor never read the letter aloud to anyone, but the night he burned it, he found the air thick with rosemary and something sweet turning bitter. From the corner of the room came the quiet clink of silver tapping porcelain. The smokehouse had stood at the edge of the property for as long as the house itself, a squat, soot-dark structure built from black pine, where meat hung from rusted hooks and salt bled into the floorboards. No one went near it after the supper, not because of the smell, but because it had none. It should have stunk of old grease and brine, but the air around it was still, hollow, like the land was holding its breath. It was the dogs that found the bones. The older one, Bristle, began to howl before dawn, circling the smokehouse with hackles raised. The younger dog clawed at the door until his paws bled. When a field hand finally opened it, what spilled out wasn't the smell of meat. It was cold air, damp and bitter, like cellar stone. The hooks inside were empty, the racks bare. But in the ash beneath the fire pit, something pale gleamed. A foot, small, no bigger than a doll's. It had been stripped to the bone, but the shape was clear, delicate, human. They dug, with shovels at first, then hands. The earth beneath the smokehouse came up soft, loose like flour. They found more bones, a wrist with 3 fingers still curled, a jawbone with tiny teeth, a rib cage the size of a loaf. Some were clean, some still wore scraps of cloth, and one had a tiny brass button sewn with red thread, the kind given to children, so they wouldn't be mistaken for livestock. The men said nothing, just stared at the pile building by the door. 13 sets, all small, all wrong. The overseer, who had remained silent through the supper deaths, crossed himself twice and vomited behind the shed. One bone, a femur, had been snapped clean in half, not by rot, but by force. Hollow inside, boiled, perhaps, cooked. That word wasn't spoken, but it hovered in the air, thick as the flies that refused to land. The master was called, but he did not come. Instead, he sent a note. Bury them, deep, say nothing. The men did as they were told, but none returned to the smokehouse afterward. They boarded it shut with iron nails and a cross made from broken wood slats, but the ground didn't settle. For 3 nights, something knocked from underneath, not loud, just enough to keep them from sleep. On the 4th night, the knocking stopped. In its place, the smell returned not of meat, not of death, but of stew, rich, thick, mouth-watering. It seeped from the cracks in the boards, warm and sweet and unforgivable. That morning, a servant swore she saw steam rising from the chimney. But when she opened the door to look, the fire pit was cold, and on the center hook, hanging by a red ribbon, was a single child's shoe, clean, untouched by ash, and still warm. It was the youngest daughter, Clara, who found the book. She had wandered into the kitchen just after first light, barefoot, chasing the sound of humming. No one else seemed to hear. The hearth was cold, the room still, but something pulled her toward the old stone floor beneath the spice rack. A loose brick shifted beneath her foot, and when she pried it up, her hands trembling without reason, She found a bundle wrapped in yellowing muslin, tied with a strip of faded red cloth. Inside lay a book, not bound in leather, but in something softer, darker, the texture of stretched hide, dried too long in the sunday. Its pages were uneven and stitched with what looked like thread, but smelled faintly of iron. Clara opened it. The first page bore no title, only a smear of black ash and the impression of a thumbprint pressed too hard into the parchment. The ink was deep red, nearly brown, and the writing uneven, slanted, as though the words had been scratched down by someone unfamiliar with the shapes. It wasn't English. Not fully. The first few pages were filled with symbols, knives, spoons, circles around open mouths, drawings of bowls filled with bones, of plants she had never seen. Some were annotated in the margins with measurements, others with tiny names written in trembling script. Eliza, Jonah, Maybelline. She kept reading. Each page seemed warmer than the last, the ink wet-looking though dry to the touch. By the time she reached the center of the book, the symbols had grown sharper, more deliberate. A series of pages detailed a stew recipe in painful steps. First the marrow, then the blood, then the whispering. One line read, "Stir widdershins until the breath stops." Another, "Serve while warm, before the soul returns." On the final page, there was a picture, crude but clear, a woman with no eyes, standing over a pot so large it swallowed the flame beneath it. Her hands were in the stew, stirring. Around her feet, 13 small figures knelt, mouths open, tongues out, waiting for the spoon. Clara slammed the book shut. When she did, she felt something crawl up her throat, not a scream, but the shape of one, like her voice was trying to remember how to leave her. She ran from the kitchen, book still clutched to her chest, and threw it into the fire in the parlor. But it did not burn. The flame curled around it, hissed, recoiled. The book lay in the coals like stone. That night, Clara went pale and feverish. She stopped eating, and when her mother found her muttering in her sleep, her lips moved in a language no one in the house had ever spoken. But outside, in the wind through the trees, something hummed in time with her breath, and from beneath the hearth, the scent of boiling bones returned. He had only wanted the pot. That's what he told them later, through cracked lips and blistered teeth. He was a peddler passing through, a man with nothing but a mule, a pack, and a hunger that never quite left his bones. The supper had already passed. The house was quiet, the family buried, the windows shuttered. And yet the kitchen glowed faintly in the night, as if it didn't know the rest of the house was gone. He swore he heard laughter, not loud, but layered, like several voices, humming beneath the crackle of fire. He crept through the side door, careful not to disturb the dogs, who only stared as he passed, unblinking and still. The kitchen was empty, save for the heat that hung in the air like a second skin. On the stovetop, an iron pot squat, soot-black and gleaming, sat untouched. There was no food inside, no spoon, no steam, just the scent of roasted thyme and blood. He reached for it, not because he needed it, not because it was valuable, but because it was beautiful in a way that made his hunger twist. As soon as his hands wrapped around the handles, the metal flared to life, not like fire, like memory. His palms erupted in blisters, then split. Skin peeled. Blood hissed against the iron, but he could not let go. He screamed, but the sound caught in his throat, choking him like a mouthful of ash. He fell to his knees, eyes rolling, and the pot remained in his grip, unmoved. When they found him the next morning, he was lying in the garden with both hands bandaged in his own shirt. His breath was shallow, his eyes milk-white, and around his neck a thin red line that hadn't been there the day before. The pot sat back on the stove, untouched, cold. No one knew how it returned. No one had heard him scream. When asked what happened, he whispered through cracked teeth, "She told me not to." He refused to say her name. He said she never gave it, that she stood behind him, close enough for him to smell rosemary on her breath, and whispered the same word over and over. Remember, when he closed his eyes, he said he saw a table set for 13. He saw hands without arms, mouths without faces, bones clean and warm. He never traveled again. He stayed in a chapel on the edge of town, feeding birds that never came. He lived only one more year, and when he died, they found him curled like a child, his hands still bandaged, still raw, and on his tongue, clutched between his teeth, was a shred of muslin tied with red thread as if he'd been chewing on memory all along. Those who survived the supper, the few who left before the first bite, or who claimed illness and stayed in bed, spoke of the food with trembling reverence, as though even the memory of it was too rich to touch without consequence. They said it had smelled like coming home, but to a place you had never lived, that it tasted of things you could not name, and left your mouth feeling borrowed. One woman, the widow of a tobacco merchant, confessed to dreaming about the stew for weeks after. In her sleep, she found herself back at the table, but the chairs were empty and the candles unlit. Still, she lifted her spoon, and the moment it touched her lips, she remembered. But the memory was not hers. She recalled standing barefoot in red dirt, wrists raw from rope. She heard screaming in a voice that used to belong to her, though she had never made such a sound. She tasted smoke, iron, and a sweetness that felt like betrayal. When she woke, she was soaked in sweat, her pillow bitten through. Another man, the master's cousin, spoke less, but what he said disturbed the doctor who visited him. He claimed he had eaten only one spoonful, yet after that he could not eat anything else. His stomach turned at bread, at fruit, at even the scent of boiled milk. He said he was full, but starving, that his body was sated, but his soul was raw. He began to speak of voices, not around him, but inside. They whispered in a cadence like stirring, not words, but rhythms. They beat against the walls of his skull like spoons tapping glass. He said they showed him things, flashes of a firelit room, of children weeping in a language he did not know, of hands, always hands, reaching upward from something too deep to climb out of. One night, his wife found him on the kitchen floor, licking the inside of a cast iron pot, mouth bleeding from the sharp edges. When she tried to pull him away, he bit her. Not in rage, in sorrow. He died weeks later, refusing to eat anything but stew. But no one had cooked it. His bowl was always empty, his spoon always clean. Still, he lifted it to his mouth like it had been filled. He smiled after every bite. And when he died, his final breath smelled of rosemary, and something beneath it, grief, copper, something too old to name. The doctor wrote in his journal that trauma had taken root in memory, that grief could masquerade as appetite. But late that night, when he walked past his own hearth, he paused. There was no fire, yet in the ashes, a single spoon rested, still warm, and beside it, the faintest impression in the soot, a bare footprint, too small to belong to any man. It started with the hunger, not the kind that gnaws at the belly after a missed meal, but a deeper ache, the kind that wakes you from sleep with your mouth already open and your hands reaching for something warm. It happened to the boy first, Simon, barely 17, a field hand's son, who hadn't even been inside the house the night of the supper, but he had eaten leftovers. Just a spoonful, he said. He found a bit of stew cooling near the back steps, still warm in a tin bowl, and thought nothing of it. He cleaned the dish with his finger when it was done. By morning, he was ravenous. He ate everything in reach: eggs, biscuits, even the hard ends of old bread no one touched. But the ache didn't leave. It bloomed. It pulsed. Within 3 days, he had taken to the root cellar, chewing through raw potatoes and pickled onions until the vinegar cracked his lips. He began hiding food in his shirt, his boots, even under his tongue, but it spoiled before he could reach it. It soured the moment it left the kitchen, as if the house itself knew it did not belong elsewhere. On the 5th day, he was caught in the pantry gnawing at a cured ham bone until his gums bled. When they pulled it from his hands, he wept, not from pain, but from hunger. He tried to explain it, said he could feel the ache behind his ribs, like something was curled inside him, growing. He said it whispered when he slept, told him he'd never be full until he ate the right thing. No one asked what that was. By the 7th day, he bit down on his own fingers, started with the smallest, The cook's assistant heard the snap from the hallway. He was found on the floor, lips glossy with blood, thumb between his teeth, crying with relief. When the doctor came, he only shook his head, said it was madness. Side grief was a strange thing, especially when buried in poor soil and deeper shame. But he refused to enter the kitchen, refused to touch the pot. Simon died that night, not from bleeding, but from starvation. His stomach was full, they said bloated with food, distended with weight, but not a single bite had been digested. It all sat there, untouched by time, as if his body knew it was wrong, as if something in him had been waiting for the stew to return. After they buried him, the dogs wouldn't go near the cellar. The floorboards above it creaked, even when no one walked there, and at night the pantry door unlatched itself. No one dared open it. But sometimes, behind the wood, they heard chewing, slow, steady, satisfied, like someone had finally found what they were looking for and would never stop eating again. The table had always been long enough to seat 12, maybe 13 if you squeezed. It was carved from dark walnut, polished smooth by years of elbows and prayer, meals and murmurs. But in the days after the supper, someone noticed what had been true all along and never questioned. Effie had always set 13 places, not 12, not 10, always 13. Even when there were fewer guests, when half the chairs sat empty, when no one else was expected, there would still be 13 plates, 13 forks, 13 linen napkins folded in the same tight triangle she made with her thumb pressed to the crease. At first it was chalked up to habit. Maybe she counted wrong. Maybe no one had taught her better. But that excuse wore thin when they remembered she never made a mistake. Not once, not in over 20 years of cooking. She knew how many guests were coming before anyone told her. She could tell a man's appetite just by hearing his footsteps on the gravel. The 13th place was never spoken of, never used, but it was always there at the end of the table, slightly apart from the others. That chair was older than the rest, mismatched, heavier in the legs, and carved with a faint swirling pattern no one could name. The seat cushion had gone flat over time, but the fabric never stained, even under red wine or lamb fat. And the plate set at that spot was unlike the others. Plain white, no rim, no pattern, but somehow more beautiful for its simplicity. One guest, a young woman who once tried to sit there, was quietly asked to move before dessert. She claimed she felt sick the moment she touched the back of the chair, like her spine had turned to water and her tongue had gone dry. Effie had only stared, not blinking, as she was reseated. After the supper, when the bodies had been buried and the house turned cold, the table remained. No one cleared the settings. The master refused to touch it. The few who dared walk past swore they saw the 13th plate steaming at dusk, though no one had been in the kitchen. Fork resting on the side, spoon dipped ever so slightly, as if someone had eaten, then stepped away for a moment. When a servant finally tried to remove the plate, she screamed the moment her fingers touched the porcelain. Her palm blistered in the shape of a circle, and she left that same night, walking barefoot all the way to the river and not once looking back. From then on, no one touched the 13th place. Dust gathered on every plate except that one. Every napkin yellowed except the one folded there. And some nights, if you stared long enough, the spoon would move slow, steady, as though stirred by a hand no longer visible, but very much still present. The grave-marked Effie sat beneath the willow, behind the smokehouse, where the soil stayed soft even in frost. A simple wooden cross marked the spot. No date, no carving, just her name burned into the wood with a brand too blunt to be clean. It had been placed there years before the supper, long enough that most believed she had died and been replaced, though no one remembered a funeral, no one remembered who had dug the hole. The grave was never tended. No flowers, no stones. Just a sagging fence around it that leaned like it had grown tired of pretending. After the supper, when the town's fear began to harden into questions, someone decided the grave needed to be opened. It wasn't official. No magistrate signed the order. No priest blessed the earth. Just two men with shovels and a bottle of rye between them, digging with the kind of fear that keeps you from blinking. The soil came up easy, as if it wanted to be disturbed. Just beneath the surface, the coffin appeared cedar, old but intact. The nails were rusted, the lid bowed, and the smell that rose from it was not of death but of dried herbs and something sweet, like molasses left in the sun too long. When they pried it open, they did not find Effie. The bones inside were wrong, larger, the pelvis wide, the skull delicate. There was a gold cap on one of the molars, the kind only worn by wealthy women. One of the men recognized it. He'd seen the mistress wear that smile in church every Sunday, but she was buried beside her husband, under a marble stone with scripture carved deep. Yet here she was, or at least her teeth, her ribs, the curve of her jaw, resting in a box meant for someone else. The body had been dressed in plain cotton, the kind given to house servants, and around the neck, tied in a bow, was a thin red ribbon, stained dark on one end. Beneath the body, pressed into the cedar, was a single scrap of parchment, faded, barely legible. The ink had bled in the damp, but one word remained clear: trade. The men closed the box and left it untouched, said nothing, but by the next morning one of them had vanished, and the other had bitten through his own lip in sleep, his teeth stained black. The grave was never filled. It remains open to this day, a hollow space in the earth that refuses to accept another body. And sometimes, when the wind cuts just right across the field, you can hear a woman laughing soft, low, the kind of sound that means she's not finished cooking yet, just waiting for the table to be full again. The sugar jar was made of blue glass, heavy-lidded, with a silver spoon tied to its neck by twine. It had always sat on the highest shelf in the kitchen, too far back to reach without a stool, tucked behind the flour tins and molasses jugs. No one used it but Effie. When she sweetened tea or dusted pastries, she never measured. She pinched with her fingers, humming under her breath, as if the sugar listened better than people did. After the supper, the jar remained where she left it, undisturbed, untouched. But one morning, Clara, still pale from fever and haunted by dreams of circles drawn in ash, climbed the stool and took it down. She claimed something had whispered her name from inside it. The lid came off easily. No resistance, no sound. But what lay inside was not sugar. Not entirely. The top layer was white and soft, but underneath, buried like treasure, was a square of muslin, something wrapped tight inside it. Clara called for her mother, voice shaking, and together they unfolded the cloth on the butcher's block. At first, it looked like a piece of fruit left too long in the sun, shriveled, dark, shiny with preserved oils. But then they saw the shape. Small, rounded, with roots at the base. It was a human tongue, dried and salted. The muscle curled in on itself like it had tried to speak one last word and never got the chance. No rot, no smell of decay. Just the thick sweetness of old sugar, clinging to the folds like it had been fed something long ago. There was no question whose it was. The mother turned pale, remembering the servant girl who'd lost her speech the year before, claimed she'd burned her mouth on the stove and never spoke again. She had vanished soon after, sent away or run off. No one was sure. But her silence had been clean. Too clean. Now her tongue rested in the jar that had seasoned every dish since. They rewrapped it and tried to bury it in the garden, but the dirt would not take it. The ground spattered up by morning, the cloth untouched by moisture, the sugar still clinging like memory, so they placed it back in the jar and sealed the lid. That night, every sweet thing in the house turned bitter. The preserves soured. The honey curdled. Even the bread carried a strange tang, like iron under the crust. No one could eat. No one dared. The jar was placed in the root cellar, locked behind 3 doors. But sometimes, late at night, the lid rattles. Not from rats or wind, but from within, as if the tongue remembers its place, as if it wants to speak again. And when it does, the house holds its breath, because whatever it says next, it will not be a prayer. They said she birthed the child in silence. No scream, no moan, not even the broken gasps most women give between pain and pushing. It happened late one autumn night, deep in the kitchen, long after the rest of the house had gone still. The fire had burned low. The stew pot sat empty. And Effie, alone but unshaken, lay back against the cold flagstone floor with her knees drawn up and her hands resting steady over her belly. No one helped her. No one was called. The midwife, when questioned later, claimed she hadn't been summoned and wouldn't have gone if she had been, said she'd seen too many strange things in that house already, said some children are not meant to be brought into the world by hands that pray. The next morning, Effie stood at the stove as if nothing had changed. Her apron was clean, her face was calm, but her walk had slowed, just slightly, like something new had settled inside her bones. The mistress noticed. She always noticed. But when she asked where the child was, Effie only turned and looked at the stew pot simmering low. "Gone quiet," she said, voice soft as steam. That night, someone heard humming, a lullaby, old, crooked in tune. It drifted from the kitchen long after midnight, and though the door was closed, the warmth of something alive pulsed against the wood. A servant girl pressed her ear to it and heard breathing not one breath, but two. One, deep, steady, the other small and soft, like a kitten nursing in sleep. The door creaked, but did not open. The next day, footprints appeared in the ash near the hearth. Small, barefoot, only a few steps. But they were there. They stopped near the stew pot, then vanished entirely. The pot itself had something new inside, not stew, not broth. Just warm water, faintly pink, with a single red thread floating on the surface. When the mistress reached in, her hand recoiled before she touched it, said it felt too warm, said it felt like breath. The thread vanished by morning. No child was ever seen, no crying ever heard, but the dogs wouldn't enter the kitchen for weeks after, and the cradle long tucked away in the attic was found, pulled into the center of the hallway outside the mistress's room, rocking, empty. Its linens damp with something that smelled faintly of rosemary and milk. They burned the cradle after that, but the ashes wouldn't scatter, and in the nights that followed, those who listened carefully could hear it again. The creak of wood on wood, the slow rhythm of a cradle rocked by hands no one could see, as if something had been born, as if it had no name, as if it had never stopped waiting to be fed. They tried to burn the kitchen on a Sunday. The sky was clear, the wind low, and every excuse had run dry. The master ordered it done at sunrise, before the heat of the day, before any more strange smells seeped from under the door. They gathered dry wood, poured kerosene along the windowsills, stuffed the chimney with kindling soaked in turpentine. The housemaid stood at a distance, hands to their mouths, some weeping quietly. The overseer lit the match. The fire took quickly, too quickly, roaring up the side of the house, like it had been waiting for permission. Flames wrapped the walls in seconds, snapping through shutters and licking the beams with greedy tongues. The windows shattered, the paint blistered, but the kitchen would not burn. The parlor, the study, the stairwell, all blackened to bone. The floorboard screamed, the roof collapsed, and yet the kitchen remained. When the smoke cleared, the rest of the house was gutted, a charred skeleton of ash and ruin, but the kitchen stood untouched, not even scorched. The hearth was still warm, the spoon still resting in its place. The pot sat full, not boiling, not cold, just full. A soft steam rose from it like breath, steady and slow, unfazed by the destruction around it. One man, maddened by the sight, rushed in with an axe. He brought it down on the stove with a shout, a blow meant to crack iron, but the axe handle split in his hands. The metal didn't even scratch. He ran screaming into the fields, muttering about teeth in the coals and eyes behind the spice rack. They never saw him again. That night, a drizzle fell, washing away the ash, but the kitchen roof held firm. Not a drop touched the stone. From the woods, they claimed you could see the firelight still flickering through the windows, though no one had dared light another flame. A neighbor, curious and foolish, approached near dusk and swore he smelled something cooking. Not just stew, but cornbread, browned and sweet, the kind you dream about in winter. He said it made his eyes water, said it reminded him of being held as a child, even though he had no memory of such a thing. He left before dark, refused to speak of it again. But when he returned home, he found his dining table set for 13. No one else lived with him. He burned the linens in his yard that same night. The next morning, the pot in the kitchen, the one they could not destroy, had something new inside, a strip of cloth, soft, charred at the edges. And when unwrapped, a tooth rested within it, still warm, still waiting, as if the fire had not failed but fed. The spoon was carved from bone, smooth as river stone, and worn down at the edges like it had been used by generations. It had no markings, no initials, no stain that lingered. Effie had used it for years, never with ceremony, never with explanation. She'd cradle it in her right hand and stir without looking, as though the food told her what it needed, not the other way around. After the fire, after the house had been swallowed, but the kitchen left standing like a stubborn root, the spoon was found in the hearth, untouched by ash, still warm, still clean. They placed it on the mantel of the chapel for safekeeping, hoping it would lose its pull. It did not. The first sign was the humming. Late at night, the preacher's wife would hear it echo through the floorboards, a low, swaying tune that seemed to rise from the walls and settle beneath her skin. Then the dreams came. The preacher woke one night choking on smoke, swearing he'd seen a girl with no face, stirring a pot with a spoon that shimmered like ivory dipped in blood. He moved the spoon to a locked drawer in the church office. The next morning, it was back on the mantel. Then the weeping started. Not loud, not constant, just soft sobs from the back pew, where no one ever Saturday. The spoon would rock in place when it happened, tipping side to side like a pendulum, but without sound. One night, a boy dared to steal it, thought he'd sell it in town, maybe get coin for its shine. He didn't make it past the edge of the cemetery, was found crawling back, hands raw, eyes wide, tongue missing, no blood, just absence. The spoon was clutched in his fingers, shaking like it remembered being used. After that, the preacher buried it beneath the altar, sealed it in a box of salt and prayer, covered it in chains. For a while, things quieted, until the child arrived, a girl no older than 7, brought in from the hills by a trader with no papers and no name. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't blink more than twice in an hour, but when she saw the altar, she walked straight to it, dropped to her knees, and placed her ear to the stone. She began to smile. That night, the spoon returned, not on the mantel, not in the drawer, but in the chapel kitchen, resting inside a pot that no one had placed on the stove. The water was already boiling, no fire beneath it, just heat, rising slow. The girl stood nearby, humming, stirring with her small hands. And when someone called out to stop her, she looked up and opened her mouth. Inside, where her tongue should have been, sat another spoon, smaller, sharper, as if she'd never needed to taste what was cooked. Only serve it. Again. They thought it was over. Time had passed, the house reduced to ruin, the soil settled, and those who remembered had either fled or buried their memories beneath scripture and distance. But then they began to die again, not in waves, not in tragedy, but in repetition, quiet, familiar, inescapable. The first was the preacher, the one who buried the spoon. He was found seated at his own dinner table, upright, mouth open, spoon still clutched in his hand. The plate before him held no food, yet the scent of rosemary clung to the air. His eyes were glassy, his lips cracked, and when the doctor pried open his jaw, a single tooth fell out, still warm. The second was Clara, the daughter who had once opened the book beneath the hearth. She had not spoken in years, her mind frayed by fever and dreams that never let go. One morning, she was found in the chapel, kneeling before the cold stove with her head bowed. Her hands were folded as if in prayer, but her fingernails had been torn away, and carved into her palms were 13 small circles, drawn in ash. Her mouth was full of salt. The third was a woman from town who had attended the supper but never ate. She'd left early that night, claiming illness. For years, she avoided the plantation grounds, even refused to say the name, but her curiosity betrayed her. She returned one dusk to see if the kitchen truly stood untouched. She never made it inside. She collapsed near the old smokehouse, a fork clutched in her hand, a linen napkin tied neatly around her neck like a bib. There was no wound, no poison, just the scent of broth in the wind. Those who remained began to understand the supper was not a moment. It was a ritual, and it did not end with the last bite. It waited. It called back its guests, one by one, whether they ate or not, whether they remembered or not, because the table had been set, and the plates had been filled, and the ones who sat down had been counted. The land itself seemed to breathe differently as the deaths continued. The pines leaned in, the soil stayed damp, and animals would not cross the boundary where the house once stood. In the distance, always near dusk, a faint clinking could be heard, like cutlery being set, glasses being raised, and spoons stirring gently in something too thick to name. Some said Effie walked again, her apron clean, her eyes dark, her steps measured. Others claimed she had never left, that the fire in the kitchen was her breath, and the hunger in men's hearts was her inheritance. But those who survived knew one thing for certain: no one eats free. Every bite was a promise, and some promises take generations to collect. They had called her the cook, the help, the woman behind the stove. But Effie had not served the family, she had folded herself into it, slowly, carefully, spoonful by spoonful. At first, it was in the bloodlines, quiet affairs between her and the master's sons, always denied, always unnamed. Yet the children who came after bore her jawline, her eyes, her silence. No one dared speak it aloud, but when the family gathered for portraits, someone always stood a little too far to the side, always in shadow. The lineage grew crooked after that. Girls born with birthmarks in the shape of spoons, boys who hummed when no one taught them songs, infants who would not nurse unless rosemary burned on the hearth. And then there were the appetites, children who craved broth before they could speak, who cried at the scent of sugar, who smiled when someone died. They said it was luck that kept the family full, while others starved. That Effie had a gift for stretching meals, making one hen feed 20, making soup from stone and wind. But the truth was in the mirror, in the way the master's granddaughter looked into the glass one evening and saw not her own reflection, but Effie's older, watching, with hands folded like someone waiting to be thanked. The truth was in the documents the pastor never dared publish, listing stillbirths that had never truly died, names crossed out and rewritten with Effie's old lettering. The truth was in the mouths of the women who married into the family and bled out on the kitchen floor with nothing to show for it but warmth in the stew. Effie had not taken revenge. She had taken root. She had passed through their blood, like smoke through linen unseen, but impossible to scrub clean. The family grew strange after the supper. Some stopped aging at 33. Others saw visitors at night who left no footprints. A girl born in the spring of 1852 refused all food unless it came from a single chipped bowl, the same bowl Effie once used. And in every generation, one child was born with no voice, not mute, not damaged, just quiet, watching, always watching. One of them, they say, was found stirring a pot in an empty kitchen, though no fire burned beneath it. When asked what they were making, the child simply pointed to the family graveyard and said, "Something to bring them back." The line had not ended. It had only deepened. Effie had not vanished. She had been served again and again, fed through the mouths of her enemies until they became her kin. Until the table was full of faces that all looked like hers. Until no one could tell where the family stopped and the cook began. The house is gone now. Nothing stands but the stones from the chimney, moss soft and leaning like old teeth in the dirt. The wind has taken the roof, the vines have swallowed the steps, and the road that once led to the front porch has blurred into field. But still, they say, the table is there. Not wood, not iron, just impressions in the soil. 13 chairs arranged in a perfect oval, their legs never shifting, no matter how many storms roll through. At dusk, when the air thickens and the sky burns the color of rust, you can see them, the outlines, shadows in the dirt. If you get too close, you'll feel it, a sudden warmth beneath your feet, like the kitchen fire never fully died. Some say the fire never started in a hearth at all, but in her. In the woman, they tried to forget, then tried to bury, then tried to burn. And every time they failed, she grew stronger. Now, travelers avoid the land. Children are warned not to stray too far from the fence, but sometimes they do. And when they come home, their mouths smell faintly of broth, and their pockets are sticky with something sweet and dark. Sometimes their fingernails are crusted with ash. No one speaks of it. Not anymore. The preacher's old church still stands, though the bell never rings. The root cellar remains locked, and in the chapel garden, rosemary grows wild, thick and twisting, no matter how often it's cut. Some nights, when the moon is too bright, folks say you can hear laughter. Not cruel, not kind, just certain, the sound of someone who has been waiting a very long time and is no longer patient. They say she walks at dusk, apron tied neat, hands clean, hair tucked back like always. She does not haunt. She cooks. She prepares. She sets the table over and over, knowing the world will bring more mouths, more hunger, more forgetting. She does not knock. She does not ask. She serves, and when the wind changes just right, you can smell it, the stew. Thick, warm, familiar. It calls to the bones in your back, the salt in your blood. It smells like home, even if you've never been here before, especially if you haven't. So when you come across a clearing that feels too quiet and the air grows warm without a fire in sight, you best keep walking. Don't look at the table. Don't count the chairs. And above all, never take the first bite, because the plate may be set for you. And Effie always finishes what she starts. Comment the oldest town in your country. And if you want more stories that whisper long after the screen goes dark, like and subscribe to The Black Chapter.